Yeah, so kind of picking up on what I've been kind of building up for a little while as far as my dissertation on relationship between creativity and spirituality. And William Therivel is someone who I've come to be interested in after writing my dissertation. So I was not really aware of Therivel when I was writing my dissertation, so I didn't really include him at all in my dissertation. But he, I found, is one of the best readings when it comes to teaching on creativity and spirituality. You've kind of seen sometimes it's hard to find good readings, or even with someone like Strensky. I was like, I really like a lot about Strensky, but some of those chapters I had to go through and just say, you have your option of reading this or this or this or this section, because if you read the whole thing, it's just going to be really long, and I don't know if it's really necessary. So, right, finding a good reading. When I found William Therivel's this article on Mozart, not Salieri, it's like, this is a really good, interesting reading. So that was somewhat of a motivation. I took a picture of these books just to kind of show how thick these books are, which is because I became interested in Therivel, I thought, oh, I want to see what else he's written. And he has written like a 6-volume series. I have 3 out of those 6 volumes. And they're not books that I was able to get through either Summit or interlibrary loans, so I did have to purchase these. But I'm kind of gradually making my way through, maybe not reading them cover to cover, but looking at particular areas that are of interest. And the other part of what made this article interesting to me, especially when it comes to teaching, and it would just be typically something like in a Core 110 class, typically just a 1 day to talk about creativity and spirituality, but also because it ties in with this movie, Amadeus. Has anyone seen this movie, Amadeus? Okay, 1984, gosh, that's getting to be almost 40 years old. Sorry to mention the number of years for any students of any particular age, but I would count myself in that as well. I remember that, I was in high school when this movie came out. So I remember this. This is a time where music videos on MTV were very popular. So there was a video from this movie called Rock Me Amadeus. It wasn't classical. It was like an 80s pop song. Anyway, here is kind of my summary of this movie. And here, I think you will be able to see more of what I was just asking, as far as what are spiritual or religious aspects of the life of Salieri and Mozart as depicted in Therivel. Therivel doesn't really give much. And that's where I thought it was very interesting as a point of comparison, because really this movie is basically the perfect example of the relationship between creativity and spirituality. But, when you're showing movies, sometimes, the thought occurs as to how really historically accurate is this? Sometimes that can be so as I was reading more about Mozart and Salieri in this movie, I came to see that, Others would argue that this is not really very historically accurate. This rivalry between Salieri and Mozart really didn't go in that direction. Ultimately, as I've been saying, I've been particularly interested in how society perceives artists and mythological portrayals of artists and things like that. So I basically see this movie as a mythological portrayal, whether it is historically accurate or not. I think there are some historical accuracies and some where there is embellishment. But I think this is a very interesting look into, a movie that came out in the 1980s that was based on a play. Later, I did see the play of perceptions of the relationship between creativity and spirituality. And part of what can justify this movie having historical inaccuracies is that from the very beginning of the movie, we see that this movie is going to tell a story not as a historian telling us exactly what happened along the way, but we're getting into Salieri's version of the story. And particularly as he is in basically a nursing home, or I guess it's actually a mental asylum, and a priest comes to hear his confession. And so the movie is basically Salieri's confession to the priest. And so in that way, it's like, well, if there's historical inaccuracies, it's basically, not a historian telling this, it is Salieri. So yeah, Salieri describes Mozart's childhood, playing a piano blindfolded in front of popes, while Salieri was still playing childish games. Mozart was playing for emperors and popes. I don't know which pope that is. Salieri's father had no love for music. So this is also part of, kind of going into that. Salieri is portrayed very much as a religious person, and basically prays for blessings of musical talent in order to glorify God through music. And sometimes you can see some of the humor, sometimes dark humor. But we can see from Faribault that Salieri's father did die while Salieri was young, and this actually changed his fortunes, that he later was able to pursue music where his father was not encouraging him to do so, became music tutor to the emperor. There's a very funny scene. I'll go through this quicker than showing the scene, but sometimes it's fun to show the scene where Salieri, Mozart is going to perform, and Salieri is there, and everyone's gathered to hear Mozart perform. And he says that he's going to play a game with himself where he's just going to walk around and see, can he recognize Mozart? Can he just tell by the way Mozart looks that here is a genius? So he's going around looking at people and, wondering, is this Mozart? Is that Mozart? He comes to a room where he's distracted by food, and, he's probably not supposed to be there eating the food. And suddenly a man and woman come into the room, so he goes and hides. And the man is being very vulgar, very crude, some sexual and other kind of vulgar kinds of comments and things like that with the woman here. And suddenly he stands up and runs out of the room. And Salieri realizes this was Mozart. So he had stood up and said, they've started without me. And so Mozart runs down the hall and comes up, and he goes to start compose the music. And that is a huge surprise to Salieri. Because like in his mind, it's like, this is a really crude person, not like a pious, holy person. So here is kind of starting to get into these kinds of ideas. Okay, yeah, we can take a pause here. That mentality that, right, you know, because he was praying like for the gifts of music, thinking that he would use the gift to glorify God. So the idea, you know, creativity comes from God. Creativity is bestowed upon a pious person. Some of these ideas. But ultimately, Salieri becomes very jealous of Mozart, at least according to the movie, and his portrayal of that speaks against Mozart to the emperor. Right. But Salieri is also a composer who has more of a status than Mozart. And there's a point where, right, Mozart's wife brings some of Mozart's music to Salieri. And Salieri's mind is blown when he sees that Mozart doesn't make mistakes when composing. So I think this is kind of another sign that can be taken. You know, there's a mentality that, you know, humans, when they're writing stories, making music, these kinds of things, are gonna make mistakes. Try something, think that that's not as good, try something else, right? Whereas he is seeing that Mozart is just basically writing it out and not making corrections, giving the idea that something else beyond Mozart is there, that he kind of thinks is being God speaking through Mozart. So if anything, Salieri has enough talent to recognize the genius of Mozart, but also that kind of tortures him to say, to see the gap between him and Mozart. So he becomes also very bitter to God for this. A scene where he takes that crucifix and boom, throws it in the fire. He plots to kill Mozart. So there's right, all this again, that's part of his confession. You know, and he, you know, wants Mozart to compose a requiem mass, basically the mass for someone who is deceased. Salieri offers to help by writing the music. He is basically composing this, dictating to him as he takes it. And eventually, right, Constance, Mozart's wife, returns, and during this time, Mozart dies. Right, so all of this is basically the confession of Salieri. And then the story basically concludes with this idea. Salieri declares himself the patron saint of mediocrity, and absolves all the mediocre people of the world. Okay, so, all right, not too much time left, but see if anyone